Thank you for joining our talk on backdooring real-time automotive OS devices. My name is Shaked Elarea. I'm a security researcher at Argo Cybersecurity. And today with me is Ariel.
Yeah, hey guys. So my name is Ariel Kadishevich, and I'm leading our security research team. So at Argus, we're developing various products for automotive cybersecurity. And our team is doing security research and consultancy for different clients in the automotive industry. So today we're going to tell you guys about the amusing story of how we got into compromising a bare metal device just to prove a point to a client and what we learned on the way. Great. So before we dive in, I would like to start with some automotive background just to get everyone straight here. So basically, a modern car today is composed of these dozens or even more than 100 ECUs. ECU, what you see on the screen, it means electronic control unit. These different ECUs, they all communicate through the CAN bus. So this is one of the most used communication lines inside of the car. And something to note, just an example, so an ECU can be, for example, the nice screen where you connect your phone through Bluetooth to play some music to the head unit. Another example can be, for example, the TCU, telematics control unit, the one that has SIM card and has some communication with the back end of the manufacturer. And another example could be the instrument cluster, which you see on the left side. This is the dashboard where you see the speed and the oil temperature. So this is the instrument cluster. And another thing to note before we start is that some of these devices have this rich operating system, like the head unit that I told you about that you connect with your phone, or the one that has cellular communication, rich environment, like rich operating system like Linux or QNX, but most of the other ECUs, they have this monolithic firmware. So it's basically one software compiled all together with the operating system, the application, and it's running on bare metal to have this real-time environment. And they all communicate through this bus. Great. So our story begins. Our story begins with this instrument cluster, not the old one that you see on top, but something nicer, digital one, like you see in the middle. And we found this really powerful vulnerability on it. So we tell the client about it, because we're doing this research, where we try to find the issues in the components, and the client was not really convinced. He tells us, well, but what can you really do with this ECU? Like, you can't really do it. It's not Linux. You can't really run anything on it. And then yes, but this is an instrument cluster, right? Think about it. How many bad things I can do that I can show, the wrong speed? Like, this is a safety critical ECU. This is something pretty important. And then he says, yes, but we have secure boot. And then our face was something like that, but never mind, let's keep it for later. Something to note before we continue is that fixing issue and vulnerabilities in the automotive industry, it's pretty hard because the software upgrade is not always available for all the types of devices in the car. And think about it, it's safety critical devices, so the testing cycles are pretty long. It's not that you can patch every week these devices, so it's not, you do it only if it's really needed. So it said, okay, there is a really serious issue and they're not convinced. We need to somehow explain it to them. So we thought to ourselves, okay, maybe we'll show them like shell access, like you do on a Linux system, or maybe we show something more visual, because it's an instrument cluster, right? And we thought to ourselves, in general, how would it look like to compromise such a device like this? And before we go into it, I want to have something imaginary to do with you together. So I want to imagine us solving some CTF on a Linux-based system. And by the way, I'm going to say Linux. We're going to say Linux in this talk many times, but Linux is just a reference for a rich operating system environment. So it still holds, everything in the talk today still holds for other rich operating systems, like Android, macOS, and others. So this is just an example. And imagine yourself solving the CTF on a Linux, okay? And you go through the agonizing process of beating those different mitigations, and you use different techniques, and maybe you find another vulnerability to have some info leak, because you need to, solve a lot of problems. And then finally, after all the agonized process, you succeed, okay? And then you run probably something like that. This is a nice example. This is a command that gives you basically a reverse shell TCP server. So this is a nice example because it's a one-liner that gives you the ability to now command and control the system through a socket. And that's great. And then we thought to ourselves, OK, now we're coming to our case. And we thought to ourselves, well, in bare metal devices, what exactly are the things that we used, the one-liner that we've seen before? We thought to ourselves, what exactly are the sockets on our device? Or what exactly is the system that we called? And we don't really have a shell there, and processes is something that we don't have there, and of course pipe. And we asked ourselves, like, where the hell are the man pages, right? So before we dive in, I just want to say that in general, I'm speaking very in general, we took compromising of a device through two major steps. The first step is achieving this initial code execution. And the second one is constructing a backdoor, having the stable execution. And while we've seen that in modern systems, the first step is very complex and very hard because of different modern mitigations, the second step is still complex, but not as complex as the first one, because you have a rich system that you can rely on. And now we want to find out how it looks like on our system.
Yes, so embeddedly speaking, we're talking about an RH850 microcontroller. These family of microcontrollers are produced by Renaissance, and they are very prominent in ECUs because of their very good and very powerful automotive support directly in hardware. So, for example, you can find support for the various communication interfaces for CAN, FlexRays, on automotive Ethernet as well. The microcontroller, this one specifically, has two privilege levels, the supervisor and the user mode, which is kind of like what we know from x86 with the ring and the privilege levels on ARM. So one last thing is that this microcontroller eventually runs a bare metal monolithic firmware, which once it is compiled and flashed, it is running there forever until, of course, it is updated, which is not that easy, as we know. So this microcontroller is just a part of this larger ECU. The ECU may contain more than one microcontroller that we work with, and this one is the only one that has access to the CAN. So our only interface with this microcontroller, with this ECU, is through this microcontroller, through the CAN. And as we mentioned, so the CAN itself is a broadcast bus. All of the nodes are connected, and they are talking and just sending messages for everyone to see. So in order to do that, we're not going to get into the details of the actual protocol, but in order to send data, you have to pack it in this CAN frame. And the CAN frame is there to decide, for example, which ECU this message is intended for, and many other stuff. But this leaves us with a fixed amount of data that we're able to send each frame. So for example, for the classic version of CAN, you have 8 bytes to work with. And for the CAN-FD, the extension of it, you have 64 bytes. OK, so we have 64 bytes, and this is the actual context that we're using with this ECU. We have CAN-FD with it. So we do have 64 bytes that we're able to send to this ECU. And let's start talking about the vulnerability. Our vulnerability starts just as a lot of others start with a mem copy. And the mem copy is copying our own 64 bytes of data to somewhere in memory. That somewhere in memory is, let's call it some PTR. Well, turns out that some PTR is actually pointing to a buffer of size, well, less than 64 bytes. Great. So we have a pretty nice, pretty classic and boring buffer overflow. But it turns out that we wanted to look at what exactly is past that buffer. And it turns out that the same sum PTR is actually located directly after the overridden buffer. So that gives us, effectively, that gives us a very powerful primitive, because we're able to override the pointer so that the next time that the mem copy is taking place, we are controlling the destination of it. So that means that the next frame that we're going to send is actually going to be copied to wherever we want. And so if that was not enough, the entire code, the vulnerable code that is running, is actually part of an interrupt service routine. So it's part of an interrupt. And that effectively means that we are running in supervisor mode. So anything that could present itself as an obstacle to us, we might even be able to overcome it. So to summarize quickly, we can send one frame that is going to override the pointer with, let's say, cafe cafe. The pointer is now overridden, and it's now pointing to somewhere in memory, which is, well, cafe cafe. The second frame that we're going to send is dead beef, and that dead beef is going to be copied to cafe cafe. Now, the problem with this particular primitive is that the third frame that we're going to send is actually going to be copied again to the same dead beef. Sorry, to the same cafe cafe. So really, we're only overriding ourselves at this point. And this is something that we're going to have to consider when we escalate this further. So great, this is a nice primitive. What can we do with it? Well, since we want to convince our client that this vulnerability is serious, we have to show him something. And this ECU, which is a part of this CAN network, it is talking to other nodes. And since this is a broadcast bus, sometimes these devices are using encryption to verify or well, just encrypt some of the messages. So that means it contains some sort of a secret inside. And well, the easiest thing would be to leak it. And this is exactly what we set off as a target. So we try to look at ways in which we can leak, for example, a very important secret from this ECU. And for example, an AES key. So we found this function called CAN send, which, as you can guess, sends data on the CAN bus. And we decided that the easiest way to call that function, to make the CPU call that function, would be to simply rope our way to it. And this is where we found out that the monolithic firmware does present some sort of mitigations, which is nice. Okay, so we have a stack canary that is supposed to protect the stack pointer from being overridden, but it's not really effective at this point because we can just override wherever we want. So this is exactly what we did, and we did some small rope trick to load the destination registers that we want ahead, and just call the function so that consent is being called with the data that we want to leak. And this is exactly what we did, and we showed it to the client, but it was still somewhat not convinced. So he said something like, yeah, this is really bad, but the keys are actually different across all cars and across all ECUs. You're not really leaking a lot of data. This is only 64 bytes. And worst of all, after you're doing this exploit, the CPU crashes and the entire system crashes, and it just reboots again. So that's really not an issue for him. Well, OK, so that didn't do the trick. How about we escalate this further? How about we try to run arbitrary shellcode on this device, and let's see what we can really do with this. So it turns out that our buffer is actually being copied to various other locations before it actually goes to the vulnerable code. And that means that, and what we found out is that one of these locations was actually executable. So we are able to just have the second frame contain shellcode for the RH850 and just jump directly to it. But this presents some other challenge that we have to work with, because as you recall, we only have 64 bytes of data to work with. And if we want to execute whatever we want on the device, we have to account for the amount of data that we use. So for example, an immediate load would be something pretty expensive, even on this RISC architecture. So for example, if you want to load some arbitrary 32 bytes of data, it takes up to 6 bytes in order to do. That is very expensive, and we cannot really afford that. So we did some other trick in order to solve this, and we used some other ROP gadget that we decided to use. This leaves us with only 32 bytes of data, and this gives us the ability to load immediate values directly onto the registers before it's actually being loaded. And then we rope back to our shellcode, and that leaves us with 32 bytes of shellcode that we are freely in control with some preloaded immediate values that we don't have to spend 66 bytes to load each and every time. OK, so this is how we write shellcode. What will we really do now? Well, the ECU itself, as I mentioned, is composed of many other different components. The RH850 is one of them, but the holy grail is the screen. So it turns out that behind the screen, the backlight of it was actually this LED strip that is directly shorted using a GPIO to the RH850 itself. So after some PCB examination and after looking at the datasheet, we found exactly the virtual address this GPIO is mapped to. And now we can simply blink on the lights. So we decided this would be a very good target, and this would be a very good demonstration to show the client. So this is exactly what we set off to do. How about we just turn on the lights, we have some busy loop, we turn it off, and then we repeat. We tried it, we wrote the code, and we tried to run it, but somehow we crashed. Why did we crash? Well, it turns out that when you are running from interrupt, it's very nice and very appealing, but these interrupts are intended to be short. They are highly prioritized, and they are intended to be short because you don't want the other resources in the system to starve. You have other tasks that need to be scheduled, and that is enforced using a watchdog timer. The watchdog timer is a mechanism provided by the hardware. It is operated by a separate oscillator on the chip itself. And when it overlaps, it triggers this sort of an exception or a trap or whatever you want to call it that either resets the system or just handled in some other way. This is very good, for example, for solving infinite loop bugs or implementing other scheduling mechanisms, but it's not really good for us because we want to just do whatever we want. So we try to ask ourselves how would we disable such a feature, and we set off to what we call the man pages, which is the data sheet. And it turns out that to disable this feature on these family of microcontrollers would not be that easy. It has to be pre-configured to a specific flash. It's not really something that we're going to do. And the other alternative would be to actively reset that oscillator each and every time. But that, again, that takes a very complicated computation. It's not really complicated, it's just a decrementation, but performing that takes a lot of shellcode. We cannot really afford it. Well, luckily, that exact routine is actually implemented inside of the firmware itself, so we can just freely use it. And so that really all it takes for us to change is that we'll just change the busy loop to just kick the watchdog over and over again. That way we will never be, the device will never die. And thankfully, what you see here is the instrument cluster itself without the screen, only the LED strip. And after sending in the message, yes, it was supposed to be sound. Yes. Yeah. OK, so
tell them what happened when you tried to do that.
Yeah. So this was we worked on this on one of the peaks on our one of the waves of COVID, and I was working from home. Ariel was working for office. As you are not blinded by it just yet, but yeah, Ariel was sitting right next to me and right next to the setup, and while you were working on it, you probably gave him epilepsy, but I think he's okay because he's here right now today, so we're good. OK, so the client finally was convinced after this. It was definitely, OK, this is serious, I'm going to have to fix it. But we were not really satisfied all the way because we wanted to know what exactly would something complicated would look like on this device. Can we really install something malicious that would do something that would stay there forever and will be really malicious? So in order to do that, we have some challenges. And the first one would be to really upload a large chunk of code to the device and then activate it and then run it. And the first step that we're going to have to solve is the thing that we cannot really override ourselves. And we're only limited to 64 bytes of data. In order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to fragment the entire code base and send it in chunks and just place it in a location in memory, which we're going to refer to as a code cave. That code cave will contain the malicious code, and that is where it's going to sit until it's triggered. Now, after that, we're going to have to worry about exiting gracefully from that interrupt, because as we remember, this is an interrupt that we are taking over. And we have to restore the original pointers that we are able to use the vulnerability over and over again and and repeat the process in order to upload the entire code. So loading the code to the code cave is not really an issue. You just load some immediate values and just store it in an address that you pre-configure because you are writing the shellcode. Exiting from the interrupt is just as the same as starting the interrupt. And the interrupt starts with storing the context on the stack. So it just leaves the same way. So really all it takes for us is to readjust the stack pointer to the correct address, and that the interrupt is safely exited. So really all it takes for us to do in order to upload a large chunk of code in chunks would be to store the bytes, restore the vulnerable pointer, change the stack pointer back again, and of course jump to the exit routine that leaves the device. We tried it, but somehow we still crashed. And this time, we found out that the MPU, which was actually weirdly configured, was actually somewhat configured. So yeah, this was some sort of a problem because we had other plans for it, but we were reminded that we are running from interrupt. We are running in supervisor mode. So luckily, the MPU itself, the settings of this register is mapped to a virtual register, which is fortunate because we are able to write to it. So just writing to 0 to this beat completely disables this feature altogether, and we're able to just write to wherever we want, which is other tasks memory and every other memory address that we wish. So now we have the entire code cave sitting there waiting for a trigger, and let us show you how you can trigger it.
Yeah, thank you, Shaked. So as Shaked mentioned, now we are left with one of the last tasks that we have. Now we want to have this ability to basically trigger having commands sent to our malicious malware. So we sort of said, OK, how do we trigger it? And I'll remind everyone that in our device, the tasks are hardwired to the firmware. Yeah, you can't just spawn a new process. You don't have the execv, for example, like in Linux. And the tasks are running on the system are not really equivalent to Linux processes. They have shared memory areas. So we try to say, OK, let's take something periodic. Let's look for something periodic that happens on this ECU, and maybe we'll use this periodic mechanism to work for us. So we went on and we found something really a periodic task that happens on this ECU, which we know that every X milliseconds it's going to be run because the ECU needs something periodic to happen on this ECU. And we said to ourselves, OK, let's build the next mechanism. So we have this periodic task. Shaked already mentioned how we do with we have this cool mechanism of write every primitive when we know how to restore everything. So we write with these primitives the following thing in the code cave. We write the shellcode that we want to write, and in the end of it, we write some of the initial code of the periodic task, and soon you're going to understand why. So we write this, and then later we write the patch on the task itself. And the patch itself is using a trigger. So we have this location with a magic number that no one really uses, and we can have this as a trigger mechanism, and I'll explain soon why. So let's see how we do regular execution. So if the regular execution of the task, if no one written anything to the trigger, it checks the trigger. If the trigger is not 0, it basically jumps to the few first commands of this task, the few first opcodes. Then it jumps back, and it continues and doing the regular execution of the task, what it meant to do. But if we do write to the trigger, for example, 0, after we've written everything we want in the code cave, the patch basically checks the trigger. If the trigger is set, it branches to the shellcode. It runs our shellcode. It runs later the previous opcodes that the task needed, and it jump back to the end of the task. And what is really nice with this mechanism, and by the way, something to know, the shellcode, some parts of the shellcode need to restore the trigger, so this won't happen every X milliseconds. And what is really nice here is that you've seen that we're not interfering with the task. So the task is still running. He's doing what he wants to do. We sometimes run something before it if we want, and sometimes we don't run. So everything is great, and we don't break the ECU at all. And before we finish, we want to talk a little bit about the impact on automotive, and not just automotive, but in general, real-time devices. So we've seen before many cool research of cars being hacked. We have the Chris and Charlie research that was done in Blackett in the US a few years ago, and we had Keenlab Mercedes research and Keenlab Tesla Wi-Fi research. And most of this research was aimed to break, the more rich operating system devices that are there before they do anything else. And what we've seen here that we talked here about the potential attack via the canvas, and usually you weren't going to think the canvas as something as, the canvas is not very complex, so the attack surface doesn't look very rich, but you can still completely compromise only with the canvas, with this vulnerability that we've shown, using only the canvas. And you should remember that all of the ECUs in the car, that we talked about, the car is like a network of more than 100 ECUs, so they can send each other these CAN messages, and you basically can run from one to another. And sometimes people even connect dongles to this, something that's called OBD port. It's like a port that technicians use to send some messages to devices, or people put their dongles there and stuff like that. So, and you should keep in mind that this is our critical ECUs, they're safety critical ECUs. And if we come back to what we talked before, we talked that we take in general, the two steps, the achieving initial execution and then constructing the backdoor. So we've seen that, in our opinion, in bare metal systems, you quite have the opposite than in modern systems. The first step is usually not that complex after you have some vulnerability, because as you've seen, the mitigations are not like the state of the art, not all of them are implemented. But the second step of constructing the backdoor and having this stable execution is harder, because you don't have this rich environment to rely on. You need to build a lot of things by yourself, and you need to get very familiar with the microcontroller you're using and the data sheet of it. So you don't have like standardization, like, I don't know, POSIX, for example, in Linux-based systems. And if we look at the countermeasure part, right? So if you look at modern system, usually in the first step you have many mitigations like ASLR, DEP, stack cookies. And in the second step you have some EDRs, access control. We have a lot of, the cybersecurity industry has a lot of products in those two steps to countermeasure it. In bare metal system, you've seen that actually we had some mitigation, we had some stack cookies and this memory protection unit. On the first part, but on the second part, we did have the secure boot, which the client told us, but it wasn't really relevant here. But it's really, we had the secure boot on the second step, but it's still partial. And I think it's not that people don't want to implement it on these real-time devices. It's just that sometimes it's pretty expensive on from a running time perspective. But that's something to keep in mind. And just to remind us all what we had here, so we started with this critical safety device. With really limited attack surface, right? Not such a complex attack surface. And then we had this write everywhere primitive, which we escalated to InfoLeak. Later, we escalated to the Disco shellcode that Shaked, like for more than a month, blinked my eyes almost every day trying to solve the issue. And later on, we constructed this functional backdoor on this bare metal device. And the thing to note here is that you need to understand that the same complex malware can still run on these stupid but crucial devices. This is something that we sometimes don't really think about when we deal with these devices. And this is something to think about as well is that think how many real-time devices are unprotected out there, because I showed you the countermeasures there are not really there yet. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate those devices, because those devices still hold secret information, and they're very crucial to our life in many different industries, like in the healthcare industry or in the banking industry and other industries that are crucial to our everyday life. And this is something that I want you to take from here, to think of these other devices that can still have this complex malware. So thank you very much. And if you have some questions, we would like to hear and answer you guys. Okay, great. Thank you, guys.